Hello, and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series and Podcast. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, join us to assess the latest round of anti-Semitism, or Zionism, sorry. Mr. Tobin will speak for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Jonathan Tobin.
Thank you, Stacey. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and good afternoon to everyone subscribing to the Middle East Forum. I want to speak for a few minutes today about what conclusions we should draw from the latest round of fighting in the Middle East and the latest round of anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist actions around the world. What happened 2 weeks ago in the round of fighting we've got between Israel and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza started when Palestinian Islamic Jihad decided it wanted to, quote unquote, retaliate for the fact that some of its terrorists, including one of its leaders, had been arrested in the West Bank. What they did was what the terrorist groups in Gaza always do, which is to say that it shot rockets randomly into Israel, attempting to kill, maim, injure as many Jews or Israelis of any nationality or religion as they could. Fortunately, the Iron Dome system, which continues to save lives every time one of these rounds begins, shot down just about everyone's. There were no fatalities directly from the missile and rocket fire, of which over 1,000 were fired into Israel during the course of 3 days of fighting. But obviously, about 1 million Israelis were forced, in the southern part of Israel and in part Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, were forced to take shelter during the air raids. One person died actually while running to a shelter. Many others were injured. Israel, as it always does, limited its attacks on Gaza to try and stop the rocket fire to actually trying to kill the terrorists. And this time, the casualties were even lower among Palestinians that had been in rounds of fighting in 2014 and last year in 2021. And indeed, one of the interesting things that happened this time was that Palestinian and Islamic Jihad rockets being fired at Israel were caught on video falling short. And actually, about half or more of all the Palestinian civilian casualties during these 3 days were the result of Islamic Jihad rockets, not of Israeli fire into Gaza. Two other interesting things happened. Number one, Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip, governs it as a Palestinian state in all but name, actually stayed out of the fighting this time. Islamic Jihad, which takes its orders and its funding from Iran, was on its own. Hamas, though it shares Islamic Jihad's murderous goals of destroying Israel, was more interested in sort of keeping the quiet, keeping the peace with Israel, and not losing its infrastructure. So it stayed out of that fighting. Fatah in the West Bank, Palestinian Authority, was also not looking to help Islamic Jihad. But there were also a couple of other interesting aspects of this. The United States, which can usually be relied on, along with pro forma declarations of declaring that Israel has the right to defend itself, was unusually quiet when it came to the usual condemnations on anytime Israel fires into Gaza. It was clear that both the Biden administration and some of its Western European allies were very interested in not being too harsh with the government led by interim Prime Minister Yair Lapid, whom they're hoping will win the Israeli election in November, or at least prevent former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from winning it. So they gave him a break. And it was clear that although the same dynamics existed as in past rounds of fighting between Israel and terrorists in Gaza, the rest of the world wasn't quite as interested in this drama as they often are. So on the one hand, we could say, well, that's great for Israel. Casualties were few. Even Palestinian casualties were not as large as they often are, because, of course, the terrorists use the people of Gaza as human shields. But I would say, as much as there were elements of this that were positive, we shouldn't jump to too many conclusions as to say, well, this shows that Israel is turning the corner. Let's understand something. As much as this round of fighting, as much as if any other one before that showed that Israel was in the right, that it was not the aggressor, that it was the Palestinian terrorists who were the ones who started the fighting, who were responsible for the casualties. All of this was as clear, or more clear even, than it had been in past rounds of fighting. But that didn't actually alter the argument about Israel anywhere in the world. The evidence of Palestinian Islamic Jihad's terrorism didn't cause any of Israel's critics in the United States to change their tune. Students for Justice in Palestine still thinks Israel should be destroyed. The Congressional Squad and members like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib are still supporting BDS. They're still against Israel no matter what it does. That didn't alter anything. At the United Nations, the UN Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry, an open-ended kangaroo court that is eager to use last year's round of fighting to back up the false claim that Israel is an apartheid state, that Israel is a human rights abuser. They're still in business. They're still in business despite even the fact that one of their so-called investigators was caught saying openly in trafficking in anti-Semitic tropes. That continues. The same thing at the United Nations Security Council itself. One of the more discouraging things, and you could say it's just a show, what does it matter? The UN is just a talking shop. But even countries that made peace with Israel, that's not just Egypt and Jordan, but even the UAE, which the United Arab Emirates, which was part of the Abraham Accords, the great breakthrough towards normalization and peace 2 years ago, spoke at the UN Security Council about this round of fighting and trotted out the same tired anti-Israel tropes, the same lies about Israel being the one responsible for it, the same propaganda claiming that Jews going to pray on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the holiest spot in Judaism, and which Muslims claim as their third holiest spot, that it was their temerity in visiting this place that somehow caused the fighting. Jordan said that, even Egypt's ambassador, and Egypt is very closely allied with Israel on the ground against Hamas and against the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza, maintaining its own blockade of Gaza. The same lies were heard at the UN. What conclusion should we draw from that? Well, it's true that the Abraham Accords has changed the world. Israel is more secure, has more friends. And it's true that Arab diplomats and Arab governments say one thing in private to Israel and one thing in public when they're speaking to their own people. But the fact remains that the culture of anti-Semitism throughout the Arab world still compels even governments that have made peace and that wish for good relations, that look to Israel as a bulwark against the country they really fear, which is Iran. Even so, they feel compelled to say terrible things about Israel, to trot out these tired anti-Semitic tropes. The same thing happens with Israel's critics throughout the world. I think that should remind us that as much as defenders of Israel like to point out Israel's morality, the fact that its security deserves to be defended, that its army is the most moral in the way that it conducts its measures of self-defense against terrorism, these are all true. But the only argument that really matters in the debate about Zionism, in the debate about Israel, is whether Israel has a right to exist, not whether its army is moral, any more than whether its scientists are brilliant or its beaches are beautiful. We who care about Israel should remember this and not be distracted by other issues, not go off on tangents, not seek to justify Israel by means of its virtues, but stick to the main argument. The whole argument about Israel is not about what it does, but what it is, the one Jewish state on the planet. And that is the one thing that its critics and its opponents cannot bear to see exist. We must focus in on this assault against Zionism, this delegitimization of the right of the Jews to one state on this planet, to focus on these basic rights and the fact that Israel's enemies seek to deny them, which is an act of anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is not merely a variant of comment about public affairs. It is anti-Semitic. It is anti-Semitism in action. Anytime we get diverted from that, ultimately, we're wasting our time. That's what this round of fighting, that's what actions at the UN should always remind us. Anything that distracts us from that basic truth is not helping to make Israel's case in the world. Thanks, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. So the first question we have is from David Levine. Bottom line, how did Islamic Jihad get to possess so many rockets that they could fire over 1,100 of them into Israel?
Well, the fact is, as much as Israel and Egypt blockades Gaza, they have ways of getting arms in. I mean, they also have their own arms manufacturing inside Gaza, which they've been working on, and ever since Israel withdrew every soldier, settler, and settlement from Gaza in 2005 in a disastrously failed experiment, hoping to create a laboratory for peace, and instead getting not merely, as I said before, a Palestinian state in all but name, but a Palestinian terrorist state in all but name. They do have the ability to manufacture crude weapons, and they are able to smuggle in, and they use pretty much every bit of foreign aid that goes into there. And let's be honest, Israel allows money in there basically to sort of keep the peace with Hamas and allow them to do things so that it doesn't entirely collapse. They use it to further their infrastructure, the tunnel city underneath Gaza, the place. It's true, as Israel's critics who claim that its actions are disproportionate, that the Palestinians don't have bomb shelters, but in Gaza, there are plenty of shelters, but they're for the bombs, not for the people. Hamas and Islamic Jihad have, a warren. Nobody knows how extensive it is underneath the surface in Gaza of fortifications and places where they can hole up. So as much as brilliant as Israel's campaigns are in pinpointing them, They're not able, short of a massive invasion, which nobody in Israel wants, and which the world would not tolerate. There's no way to simply wipe out their military infrastructure. It's a fact of life. And as the Israeli military says, they have to go in and mow the grass every now and then, which is kind of a cynical and it's a tough thing to say. But so long as the basic fact is that Israel is not going to go into Gaza, doesn't want to face the casualty losses that would be involved in such a campaign, knows that it's basically politically impossible inside Israel and in international forums. These terrorist groups, which are have plenty of funds, and in the case of Islamic Jihad, they're directly part of the Iranian terrorist network. They're going to remain heavily armed.
Thank you so much for that. Jay asks, why is the Egyptian blockade of Gaza never criticized or mentioned in the press?
Well, of course it isn't, because it's not Israel's blockade. Nobody cares what Arabs do to Arabs. Nobody cares what the Palestinians do to Palestinians. Nobody cares that the Palestinian Authority is a corrupt, tyrannical government which exploits its own people. Mahmoud Abbas, who this week made some headlines by going to Germany and in Berlin, on the 50th anniversary of the Munich Olympic massacre, which he helped organize and fund, claimed that Israel, rather than apologize, he said Israel had created 50 Holocausts in the ultimate chutzpah, and why? And as I wrote this week, why should anybody even be outraged? I mean, he's a Holocaust denier, he's a terrorist funder in the past and today, and yet everyone in the international community, and indeed many in Israel, still want to treat him as a legitimate peace partner. So, these are just, these are the realities of Palestinian life. These are the realities of international discourse. The only way a Palestinian suffering can be noticed by anyone is if it can be in some way attributed to Israeli actions. This is, again, another manifestation of the anti-Semitism that drives so much of the opposition to Israel. Again, it's another sorry and it's a terrible fact of life, but that's a fact. If you're expecting the New York Times to do a series on Egyptian attacks on the Palestinians or on Palestinian misrule of the Palestinians, don't hold your breath.
Thank you so much. And what you were just saying about Abbas in Germany, a different David Levine asked, Chancellor Scholz said nothing at the time. What's your reaction?
Well, that's, it was disgraceful that he didn't push back against it. If you watch the tape of their encounter, there are a couple of really interesting things. One is that when Abbas said the business about Holocaust, he said it in English. It wasn't like he was trying to be obscure. He wanted the international press to hear that, Also, interestingly, that as when Abbas went off to his usual rants about Israel, the German chancellor actually did say, I don't agree with you calling Israel an apartheid state, that's wrong. Which, okay, thanks. Thanks for nothing almost. But no, he did not respond to the Holocaust manner, and he got a lot of criticism inside Germany for this, where it is, they don't have a First Amendment. That is actually possibly illegal what Abbas did in terms of his Holocaust denial and that kind of religious, slander. But these Western European leaders are always very reluctant. I mean, Abbas is their guy. What is he doing there anyway? It's not like he's some legitimate leader. For them to invite him on the 50th anniversary of the Munich massacre is itself an insult, is itself a sign of, insensitivity. Doesn't quite cover it, does it? Why aren't we holding him accountable? The man who wrote, his doctoral thesis in Moscow about, which was Holocaust denial, why does anybody still treat him as legitimate? The answer is he's the Palestinian leader, and he's the embodiment of Palestinian nationalism, which is inextricably, alas, tied to their 100-year-old war on Zionism. So he still gets treated that way.
Fantastic points. JL asks, this issue has been discussed for years. At what point do Israelis and Zionists need to stop being concerned about whether Israel or Jews are liked or not and simply continue to build the state? Trying to defeat anti-Zionism is like trying to defeat anti-Semitism, a complete waste of time.
I think you're half right with that. Of course, what Israel must do, as it always has done, as David Ben-Gurion said, we have to care less about what the non-Jews say, but about what the Jews do. However, I think it is foolish to think that the anti-Semitism that goes on, for example, at the UN has no impact at all. Of course, it has an impact. If the Palestinians and their anti-Semitic international allies can succeed in making Israel, their goal is to make Israel South Africa in the 1980s, and to break it. Now, we can say that's never going to happen. Israel is nothing like South Africa. There is no apartheid in Israel. It's all a big lie. But the UN has the ability, the UN Human Rights Council, the potential there for making it difficult for Israel to operate in the international sphere, to do business around the world. It's true, BDS here in the United States is an enormous flop, and to a large extent, it's an enormous flop even in terms of Israel itself. The BDS people haven't laid a glove on Israel's, startup nation, first world economy. BDS is a manner of, it's a form of anti-Semitism that targets American Jews on college campuses and elsewhere more than anything else. So yes, we have to push back against that because it's the self-defense of American Jewry that's at stake. But it's also foolish to pretend as if what goes on at the UN doesn't matter at all, that it's just a talking shop. It actually does have power to harm Israel. And it's vital for the United States, as the country that funds about a quarter, that contributes, and U.S. taxpayers, pay for at least 25% of everything that goes on at the UN, to be quiescent about our money funding things like the UN Human Rights Council, which is not just slander, but which is part of a campaign to actually isolate Israel and make it impossible for it to act and do business on the international stage, in spite of the Abraham Accords, in spite of everything else. So we can't sit back and treat this as if it doesn't matter. We have to fight it. We have to try to defund it. We have to stop it if we can, and never to let it go unanswered.
Speaking of funding in a different way, Stephen Orlow asked, would you characterize European governments that financially support NGOs tied to terrorist organizations as anti-Semitic?
Well, you can certainly draw that inference. That isn't necessarily the motive of some of the European governments, which believe they're doing good and helping Palestinians, in terms of economically and civil society. But in truth, a lot of these NGOs, which Israel has tried to shut down, are linked to terrorist organizations. Their purpose is to aid the BDS movement and the war on Israel. So no, they should not be doing this. They should be holding the Palestinians accountable. There's nothing wrong with wanting to help the Palestinians. The Palestinians should be helped. The Palestinians should be helping themselves by having, governments and leaders that serve them. And, if they were truly interested in a Palestinian state, and two-state solution, they'd be doing what the Jews did before 1948, which is to build up their institutions and their economy and to create a state. But they haven't done that. They've just created terrorist movements which exploit and steal. People like Abbas, who he and his family have grown rich, skimming from all of the aid that is poured into the Palestinian Authority. And not only that kind of corruption, but funding terrorism through their pay-to-slay programs. as well as, the fact is that, Islamic Jihad and Hamas are actual, terrorist, active terrorist organizations, getting money from foreign actors like Iran. So, yes, I think it's fair to say that all aid to sort of anti-Zionist groups that are Palestinian groups that are basically fomenting the ongoing war are both anti-Semitic and anti-peace, despite the claims that they're trying to do it for peace.
Absolutely. Bradley Martin asks, given the extremely high rates of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism across the Muslim world, as much as 90% according to Pew, does this threaten the long-term viability of the Abraham Accords?
Well, you've hit on something that I wrote about last week. The great thing about the Abraham Accords is that it showed that, these Arab states have common interests with Israel, and that, Israel, is a formidable ally for them against Iran. Israel is also a trading partner. It's a way for them to, do commerce not only with, the best economy in that region, but with the rest of the world. However, all of the governments that have made peace or normalized relations, they're not democracies. They are not, they are autocracies or, kingdoms. And, this has been done against the will of most of their people. Now, in a place like the United Arab Emirates, we can see that anti-Semitic spirit breaking down. We can see that there's more openness and ability to and willingness to put away the old war, not to be held hostage to the Palestinian war against Israel. But the truth is, throughout the Arab world, as you say, the spirit of anti-Semitism is very strong, especially in countries like Egypt and Jordan, which are formally at peace. But it's the peace between the Sisi regime and the Israeli government is very warm. It's not cold. But in terms of the people of Egypt, anyone who participates in normalization or goes to Israel, is seen publicly with Israelis, is put in Coventry, is anathematized. It's socially unacceptable. It's a way to get thrown out of civil society. So it is worrisome that this anti-Semitism is still virulent. It still forces those governments, as I said earlier, to take stands and say things that maybe they would rather not say against Israel. But the mere fact that they have to shows that they worry about how powerful and how popular anti-Semitism in their countries is. I think it would be wrong to say that the Abraham Accords hasn't chipped away at it a bit, hasn't made it more acceptable to think clearly and rationally in the Arab world about Israel. But it would also be over-optimistic on the part of those, especially those who are eager to celebrate the achievements of the Trump administration, which should be celebrated, to ignore the fact that they are not necessarily permanent. They can be reversed. All those governments, they're, I'm not saying that they're all about to be overthrown, quite the contrary. But if they were replaced by governments, as happened briefly in Egypt when the Muslim Brotherhood took over, there would be no normalization with Israel. It would be swept away. The war against Israel is not over. And it's foolish for anybody to think that it's about to be over.
Thank you. And do you have any last minute recommendations that we can do to change this? I know it's a tall order.
Okay, yeah. So let's figure out in 30 seconds how to change the world. Listen, it's our duty to speak up. It's our duty to speak the truth about Israel, to speak the truth about anti-Semitism, to bear witness to it, to make our feelings, our demands known to our political leaders. I attended an event in Philadelphia this week where we had an interesting thing where the man who might be the first Muslim U.S. senator, Dr. Mehmet Oz, basically gave a speech that is as pro-Israel as you could get from anybody in the Jewish community, and probably more pro-Israel than most people in the Jewish community would do. He's opposed to any territorial concessions on Israel's part. Now, he may not win. In fact, he's losing badly in the polls right now. But it shows we have to reach out, make friends, make allies, but always speak up. Focus on what's important. As I said, focus on the war against Israel. Don't get trapped in the minutia. Don't be justifying Israel because of its virtues or because of something about it that you think will persuade people. Although obviously common values are important, you need to speak up. That say to people, make it clear that the issue is not what Israel does, but what Israel is, a Jewish state, and that it has a right to exist, and that those who would deny it are discriminating against Jews. And as the lawyers would say, the term of art for that is anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. Thank you. And before we go, can you tell our viewers where we can find some more of your work?
Well, you can read me pretty much every day at jns.org. The Jewish News Syndicate, go to jns.org, subscribe to our newsletter. And you can read columns by me, news about Israel that you can't get anywhere else, news, analysis, opinion that provides you with the kind of perspective that anybody who cares about Israel really needs. And thanks. And thanks to the Middle East Forum for inviting me to speak to you today.
Of course, we're happy to have you again. We've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Mr. Tobin, for joining us today. For our viewers, please be on the lookout for our weekly webinar offerings email coming out over the weekend. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.